Chapter 5 Visiting. Mandy and Jack's first call was at Amy Fenton's house. Amy's dad runs the lumberyard at Walton Road, Mandy said as she and Jack cycled up Main Street. That's a good place to start if we're looking for wood. Jack nodded. Amy Fenton, he said. I haven't met her. Is she in your class? She's in James's class, Mandy replied. She took a quick sideways look at him. She's got a pet mouse named Minnie. Jack cycled on, his eyes straight ahead. Here we are, Mandy said, and there's Amy in the garden. She braked and leaped off her bike, waving to Amy. Amy, she called, we've got a really big favor to ask. Mandy explained what she and Jack were looking for, and Amy said she would ask her dad if he could help. Come and see Minnie while you're waiting, she said. Mandy smiled. She hadn't even had to ask. You'll love Minnie, Mandy said to Jack as Amy took them into her bedroom and went off to get her dad. Jack looked at the little white mouse in its cage. It pushed its tiny pink nose up against the bars, twitching its whiskers and looking at them with bright eyes. Mandy gently opened the cage and took Minnie out, letting her run up and down her arm. You hold her, Jack, she said, but Jack shook his head. I think Amy's coming back, he said, turning away. Mandy sighed. It wasn't going to be easy getting Jack interested in another pet. Great news, said Amy, coming into the room. Dad says he can let you have some scraps. He'll deliver them to the Lilac Cottage tomorrow, if that's all right. Terrific, said Mandy. She giggled as Minnie scampered up her arm and tickled the back of her neck. And Mom says Aunt Julia has loads of old cans of paint lying around in her garden shed, Amy finished. Even better, Mandy said. We'll go there right now. Mandy sighed. Amy's Aunt Julia was Richard Tanner's mom, and Richard Tanner had a Persian cat named Duchess. If Jack didn't like mice, maybe he would like cats better. But Jack didn't seem to like Duchess any more than he had liked Minnie. The Persian cat stalked through the garden in front of them as they made their way out to the shed. Isn't she beautiful? Said Mandy, bending down to stroke the cat's long, silky fur. Jack stretched out a hand to Duchess, but the cat must have sensed his reluctance. She backed away from him. Jack drew his hand back quickly. She won't hurt you, Richard said. I don't like cats much anyway, said Jack. Richard nodded. That must be it, he said. Cats know when people don't like them. Mandy sighed as she watched Duchess flick her tail and disappear behind the garden shed. But they did come away with 4 half-full cans of paint. The next house they tried was where Gary Roberts lived. Gary wanted to be an inventor when he grew up, so his bedroom was always full of junk. Or so his mom said. I bet Gary has something useful, said Mandy. While Gary searched through his bedroom closet, Jack inspected Gary's garter snake, Gertie. Mandy held her breath. He looked really interested. Gertie slithered toward him, her green and yellow body gleaming. She raised her head slightly, her tongue flicking in and out. Jack and Gertie stared at each other. Maybe Jack would like a snake, Mandy thought. I knew I had one of these somewhere, Gary yelled from the depths of his closet. There was a honking sound and Jack spun around, forgetting about Gertie. Mandy put the snake back in her tank and looked at the rusty, old-fashioned motor car horn in Gary's hand. Oh, thanks, Gary, she said. That's going to be really useful. Jack took the horn and turned it around. The rubber bulb was almost worn through in places, and the metal clip was rusted. This is great, he said, grinning at Mandy. Don't mention it, Gary said. Anytime. Now, I thought I had a steering wheel in here somewhere. Don't bother, Gary, Mandy said hastily. The horn is enough. Mandy packed the horn into her bicycle basket alongside the cans of paint. What else do you need? Said Jack. Mandy looked at her list. Rope, she said. I wonder where you could get that. I could chop a bit off Mom's clothesline, said Jack. Mandy gave him a look. And get in trouble? She smiled. Even if she wasn't being very successful with his pet idea, Jack was certainly friendlier than he had been before. I know, he said. Laura said she got a new jump rope yesterday. Maybe she'd let us have her old one. Good idea, said Mandy. Let's go. Laura met them at the door, her face flushed with excitement. Oh, you'll never guess, she said. Fluffy is having your kittens right now. Now? Mandy breathed. Oh, Laura, that's wonderful. How is she? How many kittens are there so far? Kittens? Said Jack, puzzled. That's what you call baby rabbits, Laura said. Come and see, but don't make a noise. Fluffy has been in a hutch on her own since she got pregnant, and she's used to everything being really quiet. Mandy and Jack followed Laura through to the greenhouse where Mr. Baker had set up a separate hutch for Fluffy. Pregnant rabbits had to be on their own because, as well as needing extra feeding, they had to start nest building, and they couldn't do that in a hutch with other rabbits. Mrs. Baker was already there, kneeling down in front of the hutch. She put her fingers to her lips as the children came in. Mandy and Jack crouched down with Laura between them and gazed at the black and white doe. The nesting box was inside the hutch. It was a simple open-sided box with fresh hay bedding. Mandy could see that it was lined with soft fur. She knew that Fluffy would have plucked fur from her belly to line the box, so that her babies would have a soft bed to lie on. Then Mandy forgot everything else, and she caught sight of Fluffy's babies, tiny, furry little things. They lay there, snuggled into Fluffy's body, their eyes tightly closed. Ugh, said Jack, they're all wet. Shh, Laura whispered. If you disturb her, she might get frightened and she might eat her babies. We must be very quiet. Mandy held her breath as Fluffy stretched and began to breathe more heavily. Her huge, dark eyes rolled toward Mandy as she strained to give birth. Come on, Fluffy, Mandy whispered under her breath. Good girl, you can do it. Then there was another baby and another. At last, Fluffy relaxed. 5, Laura whispered, as Fluffy bent her head to her babies. Do you think she's finished? Mrs. Baker nodded. It looks like it, she said quietly. Look at the way she's licking her kittens now. Laura turned a shining face to Mandy and Jack. Oh, wasn't that wonderful? She said. And all our babies look just fine. Jack was looking at Fluffy and her babies. His face lit up in a way Mandy had never seen before. Oh, she said. Wasn't that the best thing you ever saw? Look at the little rabbits. They're so tiny and helpless. They can't see or hear yet, said Laura. Their eyes won't open for another 10 days. Mrs. Baker smiled. They've got their mother to look after them for the next 2 months. They'll depend on her milk, she said. And after that, we'll have to find homes for them. Jack turned to her. But who will you give them to? He said. To people who will love them and care for them, Mrs. Baker said. Maybe even someone like you. Me? Said Jack, as if he couldn't believe it. You mean I could have one of Fluffy's babies? Mandy looked at Jack, her eyes shining. Mrs. Baker examined Jack's eager face. Oh, please, Mommy, said Laura. I can tell Jack all about taking care of rabbits. Are you used to taking care of a pet, Jack? Mrs. Baker said. They can be a lot of work, you know. Jack flushed, and Mandy held her breath. I used to have a dog, he said, but he died. I'd like another pet now. Mrs. Baker looked from Jack to Laura to Mandy. I just know Jack would love his pet, Mandy said. Mrs. Baker smiled. Then why don't you ask your parents? She said to Jack. If they say yes, then you can be the first to choose, Jack. You can have the pick of Fluffy's litter. Jack's face blazed with happiness. I'd like that, he said. I'd like that a lot. Mandy felt the smile spreading over her own face. Success! When they got back to Hubbard's Corner, Mrs. Gardner was just coming out of the kitchen door into the garden. Jack skidded his bike to a halt and raced across to her. Mom! Mom! He yelled as he ran. Laura says I can have one of Fluffy's baby rabbits if you'll let me. He stopped in front of his mother, looking up at her. A baby rabbit? Mrs. Gardner said. A new pet? Jack bit his lip. I know you're really busy, but it wouldn't be any trouble, he said. It's just a little rabbit. Mrs. Gardner smiled. I think we could manage to give a little rabbit a home, she said, as long as you promise to look after it. Jack's face lit up. Oh, I will, Mom, he said. So can I really have a rabbit as a pet? Mrs. Gardner looked across the top of Jack's head at Mandy. Then she crouched down in front of Jack and put her arms around him. Of course you can, Jack, she said. She looked into Mandy's eyes, smiling. I think that's a wonderful idea.